Control L.
So the Concorde was made on January 21st, 1976, and its last flight was on November 26, 2003. The Concorde was very important to the aerospace industry because it's a pioneering aircraft for its groundbreaking technological innovations and its impact on commercial aviation. Its symbolic status as a feat of international cooperation and engineering excellence.
The first and only successful Concorde was the first and only successful supersonic commercial passenger jet, and it was able to reach speeds over Mach 2. The Concorde introduced and popularized several advanced technologies such as the delta wings, an elegant and functional aerodynamic shape, and variable engine intakes that adapt to supersonic speeds. The Concorde was the first supersonic commercial airplane built by aircraft manufacturers in Great Britain and France. The Concorde flew thousands of passengers across the Atlantic at twice the speed of sound for over 25 years. In 1989, Air France signed a letter of agreement to donate a Concorde to the National Air and Space Museum upon the aircraft's retirement. So in 2003, Air France honored this agreement, donating the Concorde's FBVFA to the museum upon completing its last flight. The aircraft had flown a total of 17,824 hours. 20 aircrafts were produced, but only 14 of the aircraft went into service.
For the development of the Concorde, it started in the late 1950s with the Supersonic Transport Aircraft Committee. British Aircraft Company tested its first flight with the BAC 221 for supersonic testing, and the first prototype flight of the Concorde took place with 2 tracker jets to calibrate airspeed and indication on March 2nd, 1968. In the 1970s, the 2 Concorde prototypes were produced and tested at Mach speeds of Mach 2, and eventually the Concorde entered service with only the UK and France having aircrafts. Later on, the US gives access to JFK Airport, creating a principal route for the next 25 years. In the 1990s to 2000s, the fastest flight recorded between New York and London was recorded at 2 hours and 53 minutes, which is one of the fastest times taken. On July 25th, 2000, an Air France Concorde crashed after takeoff from a piece of debris, popping a rear tire, causing parts of the tire to pop the fuel tank and causing the engine to catch fire. After the crash, both Air France and British Airlines withdrew service of the Concorde to begin improvement of the aircraft. In late September, the improvements were made with the wheels and the fuel tanks being improved. British Airlines and Air France reapplied for the airworthiness and continued the flights. In late April of 2003, British Airlines and Air France announced at the end of the year the Concorde program would be retired. The cost of the Concorde. One Concorde costed roughly $46 million, and estimated for inflation for today's price, it would be $350 million. The development costed roughly around $1.14 billion to $2 billion, split between both France and the UK. Of the 16 planes built, costing a total of $119 million, only $348 million was recovered through sales and returns.
Moving on to the dimensions and properties of the aircraft. The empty weight of the Concorde was 92,080 kilograms. Meanwhile, the max payload was 13,380 kilograms. The maximum takeoff weight with fuel and payload was 185,000 kilograms, and the max landing weight was 111,130 kilograms. Overall, the fuel weight was 95,680 kilograms. Moving on to more of the dimensions, the overall length of the Concorde was 61.66 meters, and the height from the bottom of the wheel to the top of the fin was 12.2 meters. The fuselage had a width of only 2.9 meters, and the whole aircraft had a wingspan of 25.6. There was the length of the root chord was 27.66 meters, leading Concorde to have a small aspect ratio of 1.85 and a total wing area of 358.25 meters squared. So, from the airframe and design overview, the main components included special materials and coatings, a tailless design, changes in the center of gravity mid-flight, and tail landing gear. So, from the special materials and coating, it used hydruminium alloy with high-strength alloy developed by Rolls-Royce, and the main impurities include magnesium and copper. The temperature limit was 127 degrees Celsius, only allowed to reach Mach 2.02 as a max speed. There was white reflective paint that had anti-flash reflective, and it used on nuclear-capable aircrafts to reflect the radiation. It also reflects the thermal radiation as well. Concorde had a tailless design, so there was no horizontal stabilizer, and that reduced parasitic drag. And instead, they used elevons for much more stable flight.
So, because of the critical Mach number exceeding, causing the center of pressure to go backwards when it exceeds that speed, they had to combat this because it would be very inefficient to try and adjust and trim the aircraft at those speeds. So, to combat this, they used fuel distribution tanks, and they moved the center of pressure backwards. So as the center of pressure moved backwards, the center of gravity also moved backwards. In addition, they used tail wheels. The tail wheels were used to protect the Concorde from landing and takeoff. It also helped to optimize the angle of attack for takeoff. In the event that the wheels touched on landing, they would compress before the engines touched the ground. So the power plant had a variable intake system, which would allow for compression of air at supersonic speeds. It used two ramps, one converging and one diverging, and this was because it would be easier and it would make the engine way more efficient at those speeds. It was able to increase the fuel efficiency at cruising altitude to Mach 2.2 beyond the capabilities of what the airframe could handle. It was also this was also easier to do because it was able to be accomplished by nonlinear controls, and it used a spill door and intake flaps to help that. For the power plant, it used a Rolls-Royce Sneca Olympus 593. The Concorde used four of those jet engines, two shaft turbojet with reheat. It was a 7-stage high-pressure and low-pressure compressor. It had 140 kilonewtons of thrust and 169.3 kilonewtons of thrust with the afterburner. And parts that received excessive heat were constructed out of titanium. And because of this, the life expectancy of the parts were considered at 25,000 hours, with the exception of the compressor and the turbine blades, which had a life of 10,000 hours. The variable exhaust nozzle was designed to have the most efficient thrust. So at speeds below Mach 0.55, the buckets would be set to a 21 degrees to form a jet pump airflow. At speeds higher than that, then they opened a secondary door, which from there the buckets would be progressively opened to 0 degrees at Mach 1 to form a diverging duct, which increased efficiency at supersonic speeds. Cockpit features include the droop nose, fly-by-wire, and a radiometer, which was added because of concerns of ionizing radiation, and help to determine the radiation at cruising altitude and allow them to drop lower as needed. In addition, some of the features in the cockpit were hybrid integrated circuits. The droop nose had a max droop of 5 degrees. It was optimized for specific cruise and landing scenarios. It was hydraulically controlled, and it had two 5-degree solenoids. The visor was lifted using a visor jack. When it lifted up, it would use an A-frame attached to the jack, and a jack lock was used to secure the jack from dropping and sinking down during flight. fly-by-wire. It was converted analog inputs of electrical converted the analog inputs to electronic inputs and controlled all aspects of the aircraft operation. It was controlled using a closed feedback system, and this made the aircraft a lot more stable than typical aircrafts at the time, since they did not have a system that could take the inputs and actually implement it without the need for the pilot to continuously be inputting those signals. It was way more robust than the typical electromechanical systems that were seen on the aircrafts during that time.
Now moving on to the performance, Concorde had a takeoff speed of 397 kilometers per hour and a landing speed of 300 kilometers an hour. It had an overall ceiling of 18,290 meters with a maximum allowable range of 72,040 meters. Concorde had a maximum speed of 21,079 kilometers an hour, and that's at 15,635 meters, letting it to fly at Mach 2.04. It flew from New York to Paris in as little as 3.5 hours.
The retirement of the Concorde. So the Concorde retired in 2003 after a number of factors. The high operating cost, it was noisy, the crash in 2000, and the limited flight availability. The Concorde was expensive to operate. It required a lot of jet fuel, resulting in high fares. It was a very noisy aircraft and had major complaints. In 2000, an Air France Concorde crashed shortly after taking off, killing 109 people on board, 4 people on the ground. It was a fatal incident. Concorde's high operating costs and noise limit flight availability. Thank you.